sun reigned high above Igniferia, like a merciless eye of fire, watching over a wide canopy of sand. Heat shimmered across the dunes, warping the horizon into wavering illusions and burning each crest into sharp relief. Nothing moved here without reason, and nothing survived for long without purpose. The desert wind drove the sand sideways in sweeping arcs, a storm of blades cutting through air, cloth and flesh without distinction. Even Zahira, born to the furnace and flame, narrowed his eyes as wind and glare conspired to burn and flay all who dared endure them. He had not taken this journey by foot. A frightened jinn had pressed the reins into his hands outside Al-Hadar's walls. No words, only a nod. The creature beneath him, a Shadavar, moved with quiet grace, each step deliberate across the shifting sands. The beast, long-limbed and hollow-horned, shimmered with faint heat, and when the wind struck right, its single curved horn sang a low, ghostly note, less melody than breath. Once prized for their beauty, they were the ancestral remnants of a line said to carry live coals in their chests. Few of their kind remained. Fewer still allowed themselves to be ridden, but this one had carried him without resistance. Beneath them the ancient river Zar-Karan cut its path through the scorched basin, a glimmering serpent of life amidst the lifeless. All of the great forges throughout Igniferia owed their heat to the breath of the river that fed them, save for those along the coast whose flames were fed by salt and storm. Zahira did not know where the Naarite came from, not exactly. The jinn who sold it to him was long dead, some dust-bitten trader who'd passed through Al-Hadar nearly a decade ago. Even then, Zahira had sensed the ore was rare, special, ancient. The blade he'd forged from it never dulled, not to time, flame, or the relentless rhythm of his hammer. He hadn't thought about the old jinn's words in years, and now that he did, it was too late to ask more.
"Wasn't me that found it. Some fire-eyed wretch came out of the dunes, half dead, talking about a place the gods buried in sand. Said if you wanted more of this, you'd follow the river north until it splits. Don't chase the tide," he said. "Take the bend that turns from the sea, and keep walking east until stone cuts your shadow."
At the time they felt like nothing, just the ramblings of a heat-struck tale meant to sell a story. But now it was the only map he had. He did not know how far the fork lay, only that it waited, somewhere beyond the horizon, where the river split its lifeblood in two. One path spilled westward into the sea. The other drifted into silence, vanishing in the heart of Vareth-Kar, a stretch of desert so vast and forsaken that only the eldest tongues still spoke of it, in whispers shaped by ritual and sand. Zahira followed the river's spine for now, keeping his distance from the water where reeds rose high and sharp. The banks gave some cover, enough to break his silhouette from the open sand. He knew better than to ride out in the open, not here, not this far north. Few jinn ever came this way by choice. The farther one drifted from Al-Hadar, the more the name Sun-Kari crept into conversation, not openly, but in fragments, in unfinished stories, in warnings left hanging like the last note of a death song, those of the broken flame. They offered no terms, no mercy. If their shapes emerged from the dunes, your fate had already been decided. Those who entered their sands, trader, vagabond, or wanderer, rarely were seen again. The sun fell behind veils of dust. Heat shimmered off the dunes in waves, though Zahira felt none of it. The Shadavar exhaled uneasily, nostrils flaring, legs pausing more often now at rises and ridgelines. Ahead, the Zar-Karan began to narrow, hemmed in by cliffs of pale rock and scorched stone. What had been a wide, winding lifeline now cut through the land like a blade. The riverbed dropped steeply into a gorge, its banks crumbling where the wind had worn them thin. Zahira slowed, studying the narrowing passage. The shadows ran deep along the walls, too narrow to ride through. Going forward meant leaving the river's shelter, climbing the sloped rise where the desert opened bare. He hesitated, then guided the Shoutout up the incline. The higher ground gave a brief view of the landscape ahead, broken dunes, scattered brush, and fractured ridgelines scorched red by centuries of sun. The cliffs behind him bore strange markings, ancient striations like fossilized fire curling through the stone. Zahira let his gaze rest on them only for a moment, but even he could feel it. Something had happened here that should not have, and the earth had never forgotten. He rounded the bend slowly. The sun had dipped low enough now that the dunes cast long shadows, tall, jagged things like waiting spears. And that's when he saw them. Still figures fixed on a high ridge of sand and broken stone, 6 or 7 in count, cloaked in bone-grey veils, their forms rigid as carved obsidian. One, taller than the rest, sat astride a lean and silent beast, its silhouette cut sharp against the bruising sky. They did not speak, they did not descend, they only watched. Zahira did not halt, nor did he turn his gaze. He guided the Shoutout slowly down the slope, toward the sheltering gully below, shielding himself from view. But he knew they had seen him, the Sundering. He felt it in the stillness of the wind, in the essence that hung between sky and sand, in the posture of predators who had already chosen their mark. The Sundering did not announce themselves, they did not threaten, they stalked. And though no blade had yet been drawn, Zahira knew the hunt had begun. After weeks of traversing the razor spines and storm-driven gales of Aureaphia's north, the rigid peaked landscape finally had begun to slope downward. The world opened before them. Broad valleys stretched in hushed tones of green, layered with haze and the shimmer of unseen rivers. It was Eira's first time ever seeing the lowlands. She paused mid-step as the wind parted the mist to reveal a realm she had only ever studied in scrolls. Groves of moss-covered trees clustered like old congregations across the hills. Strange hoofed beasts grazed in the glens below, long-antlered and white-eyed, creatures of the lowland lore she once thought exaggerated. Birds with gilded throats sang melancholic notes from the boughs of distant trees, and further still, a line of creatures crept single file near a stream, wolfish in shape but leaner, with coats that shimmered like silvered bark. The smell overwhelmed her most of all, earth, not stone, grass and loam and something sweet in the wind, wild and flowering. The wind had not abandoned them, but it no longer screamed like a wounded beast. It lingered now, low and deliberate, as if waiting for a reason to rise again. Eira stopped at the edge of a wide rock shelf. Her gaze swept across the vast scenery, but her shoulders did not lower. The bruises from the fall throbbed dully beneath her houppelande, still echoing their lesson, though she kept them unspoken. Behind her, Silas halted.
"That's the end of the teeth."
She glanced sideways.
"And the beginning of what?"
He didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, as if trying to hear something buried in the quiet. They had outlasted the mountains, but not the mystery. The wind still stirred, and the tremors were still happening. What waited ahead no longer frightened her. What didn't reveal itself behind them did. They came upon a patch of level ground near the base of a sloping hill, enclosed on 3 sides by weather-worn stone and half-buried roots. There, without discussion, they made their camp. Silas crouched near an old fire ring, coaxing sparks into tinder with practiced strikes of flint. Eira sat nearby, cross-legged, her hands resting open on her lap. She closed her eyes and tried again to summon what she had felt on the cliff, the strange heaviness in her chest, the pull of something vast and unseen. Nothing. The fire sparked to life, licking up against the gathered twigs. Silas glanced her way, then back to the flame.
"You've been at it since we stopped. Maybe what you need now is rest."
Eira didn't deny it.
"I thought perhaps I could call it again."
He stirred the embers with the edge of a twig, watching the sparks lift and vanish.
"There's more in you than you think. I saw it when you fell. Trust that when the time comes, the wind will return to stand at your side.
She let her breath out slowly.
What if it never does? What if it was just luck?
He looked at her, then laid back to rest. His last words came quiet, as if passing on something he'd carried too long.
Then you keep walking, because I know your name will echo long after this old windwalker fades.
Later, as night deepened, while Silas slept, Eira remained beside the embers. The wind curled along the grass, not in gusts, but in pulses. It seemed to linger, as though watching her in return. A thin thread of ash rose from the dying fire, the wind wisping it away before it had time to fully form. Eira laid back on the moss and looked toward the sky. There was nothing above, no stars, no moon, but she felt the weight of something vast just beyond the clouds, a presence without shape. She closed her eyes and whispered, not to herself, but to the air.
I'm still here.
No answer came, but the ashes held their spiral a moment longer before the wind took them. The mountain stronghold of Felzheim had not known silence since even before its founding. From the oldest shaft to the highest parapet, the iron deep-fast rang always with the chorus of dwarven life, hammerfall, hearthfire, forge chant, and the distant groan of shifting stone. To outsiders, this cacophony was brash and discordant, but to the dwarves it was music, and they understood its every note. Yet in recent moons, that music had begun to falter. The tremors, once feared, now familiar, had begun to lessen. But what followed was not relief, but unease. For the silence that followed felt stranger than the shaking. The ore veins continued to bleed slower, as if the mountain itself had begun to withhold. In the upper ranges, molten stone reacted differently when poured into the crucibles. And far below, in the black halls of the deep, even the rhythm of pick and chisel had dulled to silence. Yet still the mighty forges of Felzheim burned fiercely, as they always had, as they always must. At the heart of it all, beneath pillars carved from world-bone granite, the Kaznurak stood eternal. A ceremonial relic of the Dawn-craft era, it was not a tool of labor, but of law, used in coronations, in the binding of oaths, and in the inscribing of sacred runes upon heirlooms meant to last beyond time. It had never gone cold, not once in 1,000 years of mountain memory. So when the heat fled it was not just fire that vanished, it was the severing of something the dwarves believed unbreakable. It happened during a naming rite. A forge thane's third son was to be bound to the craft with hammer and brand, in the presence of the gathered stewards of the lower ring. The sigils were prepared. The oaths were spoken. The anvil had stood ready, as it had for every rite since the founding of the first halls. The young apprentice stepped forward and pressed his palm upon the binding mark etched onto the surface, but he did not cry out. He flinched only at the cold. The rune priest stepped forward, troubled, and held his hand above the anvil's face. No warmth, no pulse in the metal, no echo in the stone, only the sound of a hammer slipping from the son's hand. In its place, silence, and what could have never failed, had. News spread fast, outward to the forge halls and council rings, downward into shafts and stone channels, upward into bellows, breath, and watchtower wind. Within the hour, the grand hall thundered with voices. Some cried that it was sabotage, blame cast at the sea elves, or worse, committed by the hand of a dwarf. Others called it an omen, not a thing to fear, but a thing to listen to. And even still there were those who claimed it was merely fuel failure, though no such lapse had ever extinguished a consecrated forge. Thane Bjornar of the Oathgrip clan drove his hand into the rune table hard enough to rattle the brass inkwells.
We've pulled stone from places that were sealed for a reason. This isn't omen, it's consequence. Elkar should have never been touched.
Grumnar Mazvul,
spat Rugsrick the Old.
You should have spoken before the picks rang. Not now with your beard half wet from fear.
Dozens of voices rose, thanes, rune priests, ledger scribes, and deep wardens. Each claimed the anvil's silence as proof of their fear, their doubt, or their belief. Yet none could say for certain why it had gone cold, and though they sat circled around the dais of the High Thane, his throne remained unclaimed. For Bjornar, son of Balgrim, was not among them. Far from the forge halls and the voices of thanes, the High Thane stood alone in the Skulnor Kaznur, a cavernous chapel carved deep in the mountain bone. The space was wide enough to hold a stone ship and tall enough that its ceiling vanished into shadow. It was not made to impress, but to endure. At its far end stood a statue of Bangot, carved directly from the rock wall. The god's form loomed high, cloaked in granite drapery, his hands ever clenched around the haft of an unseen hammer. Bjornar stepped across the worn causeway, the echo of his boots lost before reaching the walls. He reached the base of the altar and removed his gauntlets. No guard stood behind him, no scribes recorded, no fanfare heralded his coming, and when he bowed low, his calloused hands came to rest upon the stone feet of the Maker, not as a ruler, but as a son of mountain and forge.
I am merely a servant of the stone. We dwarves can shape only what we are given, but the will of the gods moves far beyond our knowing.
He drew a breath and spoke into the silence that had waited for him.
If this is warning, give me understanding. If this is judgment, then let it be mine, and mine alone.
No voice answered, no sound returned, but far below the stone of Felzheim, deep down past vault and vein and hollow, something shifted, a fracture before the breaking of the worlds.